يريدون أن يطفئوا نور الله بأفواههم ويأبى الله إلا أن يتم نوره ولو كره الكافرون.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, brothers, sisters and friends, and welcome to Face the Faith with Hamza Andreas Georges, all the way from the UK. Now, brothers and sisters and friends, today I want to talk about the book, The God Delusion. Now, this book was written by Richard Dawkins, who is known as the popular scientist in the West, the professor from Oxford University. He is known in Europe, across the world, and specifically, he is known in the United States of America. Now, his book has had some kind of resonance. It's affected the minds of people who believe in God, and specifically, it has affected the minds of the Muslims. For example, this week alone, I received emails from brothers and sisters complaining about the effect this book has had on certain individuals in their family. So, what I would like to do is actually deal with this book, respond to this book. And I want to do it in the following way. I want to, one, respond to what Dawkins considers his central argument, and two, respond to what philosophers consider his central argument. Now, before I do this, I'd like to note that when I picked up this book, I expected new reasons put forward to form a positive case for the atheist worldview. But I have to say I was thoroughly disappointed because what I read were rehashed, incoherent arguments that made me realize that Richard Dawkins is not very well read in philosophy. Now, let's respond to the first point, which is responding to what Dawkins considers his central argument. Now, on pages 157 to 158 on the God Delusion, Dawkins summarizes what he calls the central argument of my book. And I have summarized it in the following way. One of the greatest challenges to the human intellect has been to explain how the complex, improbable appearance of design in the universe arises. 2. The natural temptation is to attribute the appearance of design to actual design itself. 3. The temptation is a false one because the designer hypothesis immediately raises the larger problem of who designed the designer. 4. The most ingenious and powerful explanation is Darwinism, evolution, by natural selection, and we don't have an equivalent explanation for physics. And 5. We should not give up hope for a better explanation arising in physics, something as powerful as Darwinism is for biology. And then he concludes, God almost certainly does not exist. Now, as a preliminary note, I have to say that his conclusion that God almost certainly does not exist is almost a joke. Because my main issue is how does he conclude that God doesn't exist from the above statements? It seems to me that his conclusion just jumps out of thin air. To infer that God does not exist just shows how invalid his argument is. It seems to me that the only delusion is Dawkins' conviction that his argument is a very serious argument against God's existence. Now, if we could conclude anything from Dawkins' argument, it would be that we should not infer that God exists just based upon design of the universe. However, even if that is true, and I don't believe it's true, but even if we could take it to be true, we can believe in God's existence from other arguments. For example, the argument from morality, the argument from the miracle of the Quran, the cosmological argument, the argument from personal experience, and the argument from consciousness. Now, if we were to accept all of Dawkins' statements, it would not be enough to reject the idea that God exists, and it certainly does not provide a positive case for atheism. In this light, I would like to show how many of his statements are actually false. Now let's respond to each one of his statements, which are the summary of his arguments, which could be found on page 157 to 158. Now, statement number 1 is as follows. One of the greatest challenges to the human intellect has been to explain how the complex, improbable appearance of design in the universe arises. Now, in response to this, I believe that it is only a challenge if you wish to take God out of the picture. It is indeed a challenge if you presume atheism to be true. But do we have good reasons to presume atheism to be true? However, someone who is reflective and thinks deeply about things, as the Quran says, يَتَفَكَّرُونَ, for those who reflect, I think the simplest and best explanation, brothers and sisters, with the greatest explanatory power, is that there is a supernatural designer. And the next point will address why God makes sense of the design of the universe. So let's go to Dawkins' second statement. Statement number 2. The natural temptation is to attribute the appearance of design to actual design itself. Now, let's respond to this. Now, this is not only a natural temptation, but a rational conclusion brought to light based upon the fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the whole universe. Now, let me start off by presenting the premises of this argument. 1. The fine-tuning of the whole universe to permit our existence is due to physical necessity, chance, or design. 2. It is not due to physical necessity, chance, or design. 3. Therefore, it must be due to design. Now, let me explain this further. Now, brothers and sisters, the existence of a life-permitting universe is due to conditions that must have been fine-tuned to a degree that is literally incalculable, incomprehensible. Now, take the following examples into consideration. The first example, the strength of gravity and the atomic weak force. Now, physicist P.C.W. Davies has calculated that a change in the strength of gravity or the atomic weak force by only 1 part in 10 to the power of 100 would have prevented a life-permitting universe. Let's take the second example now. The Big Bang's low entropy condition. Now, Roger Penrose of Oxford University has calculated that the odds of the Big Bang's low entropy condition existing by chance are on the order of 1 out of 10 to the power of 10. Now, Penrose comments, I cannot even recall seeing anything else in physics whose accuracy is known to approach even remotely a figure like 1 in 10 to the power of 10. Now, the third example is my favorite. It's about the volume of the phase space of possible universes. Now, the same professor, Professor Roger Penrose of Oxford University, he says, in order to produce a universe resembling the one in which we live, the creator would have to aim for an absurdly tiny volume of the phase space of possible universes. Now, this may sound like scientific mumbo-jumbo, but we should ask the question, how tiny is this volume? Now, brothers, sisters and friends, according to Roger Penrose, this volume is 1 over 10 to the power of x. And I ask you, what is x? Well, x is 10 to the power of 123. Now, this is smaller than the ratio of the proton. Now, even if you don't understand what these numbers mean, take the practical manifestation of this, which is, imagine I'm a dartsman and I'm holding a dart and I have to hit the center of a proton. Wait a minute. If the entire universe was my dartboard. So there's only 3 possible explanations for this. 1, it's physical necessity. 2, it's chance. And 3, it's design. Well, I would argue it cannot be physical necessity because it's extraordinarily implausible. There is just no good physical reason why these constants and fine-tuning and quantities should have the values that they have. This is why P.C.W. Davies states, even if the laws of physics were unique, it doesn't follow that the physical universe itself is unique. The laws of physics must be augmented by cosmic initial conditions. Also, for us to claim that these values and this fine-tuning is just via physical necessity, it would mean that a universe to exist that could not permit life could never exist. But this is an impossibility because we have seen any slight change of these values or constants would mean that that universe would not be here at all. Now, why can't it be chance? Now, it can't be chance because we have to understand how high these chances are, how improbable it is rather. You know, for example, would we say that it's just chance if an elephant was sleeping in the garage overnight? Or a 747 aeroplane ended up parked in the garden? You know, even in saying this, and I'm stuttering slightly for this because it's a bit of a joke, because even in saying this, you still have atheists who say it's still chance. And even after the irrational perspective is highlighted, they still hold on to the theory of chance. Now, in response to this, I would say that it's not just about chance. It's about something that the theorists call specified probability. Now, specified probability, brothers and sisters and friends, is a probability that also conforms to an independent pattern. Now, let me illustrate this. Now, imagine you have a monkey in your room, and you leave this monkey in your room for 24 hours, and you allow it to type randomly on a computer. And when you wake up in the morning, you see that printed on the table is, "O Romeo, wherefore art thou, O Romeo? Deny thy father and deny thy name." Now, the monkey has miraculously written out a Shakespearean sonnet. Now, you may have expected random words such as house, car, and apple. However, in this case, not only have you seen the improbability of typing intelligible English words, but they also conform to the independent pattern of English grammar. This is the same case with accepting that fine-tuning of the universe to permit life was just by chance. So the best conclusion, the inference to the best explanation, is that it must be design. Now, let's take Dawkins' statement number 3 now. He says the temptation, which he's alluding to the design hypothesis, is a false one because the designer hypothesis immediately raises the larger question or the larger problem of who designed the designer. But brothers, sisters and friends, the above statement, which is a contention to the design argument we just mentioned, is flawed for many reasons. Firstly, anyone with a basic understanding of the philosophy of science will conclude that in the inference to the best explanation does not require an explanation. Now, take the following example into illustration. Imagine 500 years from now, a group of archaeologists start digging in a park in London, and they find parts of a car and a bus. Now, they would be completely justified in inferring that these finds were not the result of sedimentation and metamorphosis, but actually products of an unknown civilization. However, if some skeptics were to come along, for example, Richard Dawkins V, and he were to argue that we couldn't make such inferences because we do not know anything about this civilization, how they lived, and who created them, would that make the archaeologist's conclusions untrue? Of course not, because the best explanation doesn't require an explanation. Secondly, if we take this contention seriously, it would undermine the very foundations of science and philosophy themselves. Because if we require an explanation for the basic assumptions of science, for example, that the external world exists, where do you think our level of scientific progress would be? But we wouldn't have any. Additionally, if we were to apply this type of question to every attempt at explaining the explanation, we would end up with an infinite regression of explanations. And an infinite regression of explanations would defeat the whole purpose of science in the first place, which, brothers, sisters, and friends, is to provide an explanation. Now, before I continue to the next statement, I would like to make a note on why Dawkins rejects the supernatural. Now, Dawkins rejects a supernatural designer because he thinks, as an explanation, it lacks explanatory power. In other words, no advance is made. Now, he raises the objection because he feels that a supernatural designer is just as complex as design. However, brothers, sisters, and friends, Dawkins' objection is problematic as he assumes that a supernatural designer is as complex as the universe. But a supernatural designer, brothers, sisters, and friends, in other words, God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is one of the most simplest concepts understood by all. And this is the opinion expressed by many philosophers, including the famous atheist, now turned theist, Professor Anthony Flew. Now, Dawkins' other assumption is that God is made of many parts. However, we believe in the Islamic theological perspective that God is immaterial, transcendent, and one. Now, just because God can do complex things doesn't make him complex. It seems to me that Dawkins confuses ability with nature itself. Now, let me go to his fourth statement, statement number 4. And he says, the most ingenious and powerful explanation is Darwinism. by natural selection, and we don't have an equivalent explanation for physics. Now, this statement is irrelevant due to the following reasons. One, evolution, brothers, sisters, and friends, doesn't have a foot in its door with regards to its argument, because it's about the initial conditions of the universe to permit our existence. Evolution is 9 billion years away. Two, evolution is based upon incalculable probabilities. And three, evolution is impossible because we have not spent enough time on Earth yet. Now let me expand on these points. One, evolution does not have a foot in the door. Now, with regards to the existence of God, as I've just mentioned, evolution doesn't even have a foot in its door because it's about 9 billion years away. Because this argument is specifically not related to the fine-tuning or the design of biological or biological mechanisms or biological organisms. Rather, it's about the fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe itself. Now, let's go to the second point and expand on that a bit further. Evolution is based upon incalculable probabilities. Now, the odds against assembling the human genome spontaneously are incomprehensible. Brothers, sisters, and friends, the probability of assembling the genome is between 4 to the power of minus 180 to 4 to the power of minus 110,000 and 4 to the power of minus 260 to 4 to the power of minus 110,000. Now, these numbers give some feel for the unlikelihood of the species of the Homo sapiens, in other words, human being. And if anyone were to accept evolution by chance, they would have to believe in a miracle, as these numbers are so high. Therefore, evolution itself would prove the existence of God. The third point, evolution is impossible because we have not had enough time on Earth yet. Now, according to the physicists John Barrow and Frank Tipler, the calculated odds of assembling a single gene are between 4 to the power of minus 180 to 4 to the power of minus 360. Now, the implications of this, brothers, sisters, and friends, are that there simply has not been enough time for the formation of the Earth to try a number of nucleotide-based combinations that can even remotely compare to these numbers. Now let's go to the final statement, statement number 5. Dawkins says, we should not give up the hope of a better explanation arising in physics, something as powerful as Darwinism is for biology. Now, Dawkins basically says that since there is a natural explanation for the apparent design in species, we basically should have a similar one in physics. But since we don't have one, then we should just wait. But brothers, sisters, and friends, doesn't this sound like blind faith to you? Now, the statement presumes, in my opinion, that scientific naturalism is the only way of establishing facts or sound conclusions. Why else would he want to wait for a naturalistic explanation? Now, Dawkins' presumption that scientific naturalism is the only way to establish facts is not true, because scientific naturalism cannot prove logical truths such as mathematics. In actuality, logical truths are required to prove scientific naturalism, and to argue the other way around would be tantamount to arguing in a circle. Also, scientific naturalism can't prove aesthetic truths such as beauty. And significantly, scientific naturalism can't prove moral truths such as right and wrong. And finally, brothers, sisters, and friends, scientific naturalism is self-defeating, as the statement that scientific naturalism is the only method to use to establish facts cannot be proven using scientific naturalism itself. Now, it can be seen from the above that Dawkins' central argument fails and is an embarrassment to the scientific community. This is why the atheist philosopher Michael Rules, he explains, unlike the new atheists, I take scholarship seriously. I have written that the God delusion made me ashamed to be an atheist, and I meant it. Trying to understand how God could need no cause, Christians claim that God exists necessarily. I have taken the effort to try to understand what that means. Dawkins and company are ignorant of such claims and positively contemptuous of those who even try to understand them, let alone believe them. Thus, like a first-year undergraduate, he can happily go around asking loudly what caused God, as though he made some momentous philosophical discovery. Now, brothers, sisters and friends, it's time for a break, and I see you shortly. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brothers, sisters and friends. Now it's time to talk about the second part of today's show, which is responding to what philosophers consider his best argument, Dawkins' best argument. Now, according to the philosopher and lecturer at Yale University, Gregory Gransel, Dawkins' strongest argument can be found on page 55, and it states, a universe with a creative superintendent, in other words, God, would be a very different kind of universe from one without. Now, this argument can be summarized in the following way. 1. A universe created by God would be different than the one created by nature. 2. The universe we live in fits better to a universe created by nature. 3. Therefore, the universe we live in is most likely to have been created by nature. Now, I would argue that Dawkins' argument couldn't be any further from the truth. This is because the universe that we live in actually makes more sense being created by God for the following reasons. The first reason being that the universe is ordered and open to rational analysis. Now, brothers, sisters and friends, if God did not exist, then the universe will not display the order that it does. And it will not be finely tuned to permit our existence. As Roger Penrose states, there is a certain sense in which I would say the universe has a purpose. It's not there just somehow by chance. I don't think that's a very fruitful or helpful way of looking at the universe. Additionally, the very fact that we can observe and perform rational analysis on the patterns we perceive in the universe makes more sense if God did exist. Because in a naturalistic universe, things would be expected to be more chaotic. Now, this does not mean a universe without God cannot be ordered. However, it is more likely that God would create an ordered universe, and since the universe we live in is ordered, it makes sense that God's existence fits well with our universe. Also, I would argue that the universe contains consciousness and beings that are aware, and therefore our universe makes more sense that God exists. Now, a universe that contains consciousness, brothers, sisters, and friends, makes more sense with the existence of God, because a universe without God would be very different to the one we're living in. Now, let me explain this. Now, brothers, sisters, and friends, human beings experience things all the time. This show that you listen to is an experience. Even talking about your experience is an experience. However, the ultimate reality that we know from any experience is that the one who experiences it, in other words, ourselves, is the ultimate reality. Now, when we realize that there is a first person, an I, me, or mine, we come to face a profound mystery. Now, the philosopher Roy Abraham Varghese puts it nicely when he wrote, to reverse Descartes' I am, therefore I think. Who is this I? Where is it? How did it come to be? Yourself is not just something physical. Now, I would agree with the professor, the philosopher, because the self is not a physical thing. It is not contained in any cell or biological structure. Because the most unchallenged and intuitive reality is that we are all aware, but we cannot describe or explain what this awareness is. One thing that we can be sure of is that the self cannot be explained naturalistically or chemically. The main reason for this is that science does not discover the self. It is actually the other way around. For science to try and explain the truth of the self, or consciousness, or awareness, would be tantamount of arguing in a circle. Even scientists recognize this. The physicist Gerald Schroeder points out that there is no real difference between a heap of sand and the brain of an Einstein. So the advocates of a physical explanation for the self end up in a muddle, as they require answer to even bigger questions such as, how can certain bits of matter suddenly create a new reality that has no resemblance to matter? So brothers, sisters and friends, if the self or consciousness or awareness cannot be explained physically, then the next question must be asked. How did it come to be? Well, the history of the universe indicates that consciousness spontaneously arose, and language emerged without any evolutionary forerunner. So where did it come from? Even the neo-atheists have failed to come to terms with the nature of the self and its source, because no physical explanation is coherent enough to be convincing. This is why Richard Dawkins, he almost admits defeat, and he says, we don't know, we don't understand. Now, brothers, sisters and friends, the best explanation for the nature and source of the self is that it came from a source that is thinking, aware and conscious. How else can the self, which is an entity with the capacity to reflect and experience, manifest itself? It cannot have come from an unconscious matter incapable to experience and ponder. Simply put, matter cannot produce concepts and perceptions. Therefore, we can conclude that the self cannot have a material basis, but must have come from a living source that transcends the material world. And this is best explained by God. No other answer provides an adequate explanation for this phenomenon, brothers and sisters and friends. Now, the third point to contend with Dawkins' assumptions that a universe with a god or designer would be much different than the one that we're living at the moment is that this universe contains objective morality. And since it contains objective morality, then it makes sense of the existence of God. Now, brothers, sisters and friends, we all believe that killing 6 million Jews during World War II was morally wrong. However, not only do we believe it was morally wrong, we believe it was objectively morally wrong. Now, what I mean by objective is that if the Nazis had successfully taken over Europe and brainwashed us to believe that it was okay to commit genocide, it would still be objectively morally wrong regardless of human experience. However, since our universe contains objective morality, then it can only make sense with God's existence. Because God, brothers, sisters and friends, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is required as a rational basis for objective morality. Because without Allah, morality is subjective. Because Allah is the only conceptual anchor that transcends human subjectivity. So the universe with objective morality makes no sense without God. No sense without Allah. In this light, the Muslim can argue, 1. If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. 2. The universe with objective moral values does exist. 3. Therefore God exists. Now let me explain this a little further. Now the question about objective good or bad, brothers, sisters and friends, in other words, objective morality, has been discussed by many theists, people of religion, and non-theists alike. Many have concluded, though, that there is no objective morality without God. This is why the humanist philosopher Paul Kurtz, he aptly puts it. He says, the central question about moral and ethical principles concerns this foundation. If they are neither derived from God, nor anchored in some transcendent ground, are they purely ephemeral? Well, I would argue Paul Kurtz is right, because God is the only conceptual anchor that transcends human subjectivity. So without God, there is no rational basis for morality. Let me explain this. Now, in absence of God, we have only two other possible conceptual foundations. 1, social pressure, and 2, evolution. Now, both social pressures and evolution provide no objective basis for morality, brothers, sisters, and friends, because they both claim that our morality is dependent on changes, which are biological and social. Therefore, morality cannot be binding. Therefore, it cannot be true, regardless who believes in them. Therefore, without God, there is no objective basis for morality. Because God as a concept is not subjective, therefore having God as the basis for morality makes them binding and objective, because God transcends human subjectivity. Now, the following statement by the eminent ethicist Richard Taylor is actually an apt conclusion to this section. He says, contemporary writers in ethics who blithely discourse upon moral right and moral wrong and moral obligation without reference to religion are really just weaving intellectual webs from thin air, which amounts to saying that they discourse without meaning. Now, brothers, sisters and friends, since the universe contains objective morality and God's existence is necessary as a conceptual foundation for objective morals, then the universe we live in makes sense with the existence of God. Now, before I conclude, let me just have a quick note about religious evils. Now, Dawkins, he claims in his book that the concept of God just doesn't make sense and religious life doesn't make sense because all evil is attributed to religion. However, I would argue this is an outdated cliche because there is a strong argument that these things are not unique to religion itself, but the common conceptual denominator is humanity. And this is best summarized by the Professor Keith Ward, the former Regius Professor of Divinity at University of Oxford, and he writes, "It is difficult to think of any organized human activity that could not be corrupted. The lesson is that anti-religious corruptions and religious corruptions are both possible. There is no magic system or belief, not even belief in liberal democracy, which can guarantee to prevent it." Now, to illustrate this, let me use the outdated cliche of religions are the cause of war and conflict, and show how war and conflict are not unique to religions. Now, in the relatively short history of secularism, the following massacres have been committed in the name of non-religious ideologies such as communism and social Darwinism. For example, we had the 70 million people die, massacred under Chairman Mao, 20 million under Stalin, 2 million no longer exist because of Pol Pot, 700,000 innocent Iraqis in the current occupation, 500,000 Iraqi children in the 10-year sanctions. So it can be clearly seen above that war and conflict are not religious monopolies, rather they are human phenomena and not unique to religion. Now, to conclude, this show, brothers, sisters and friends, has attempted to respond to Richard Dawkins' bestseller, The God Delusion, by responding to his central argument and the argument that philosophers consider to be his best. However, intellectual gymnastics, no matter how truthful, seldom convince others. So I thought it would be best to allow the expression of God, the expression of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Quran, to have the final say. In wonderful eloquence and sublime style, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "In the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the alternation of the night and day, and the ships which sail the seas to people's benefit, and the water which God sends down from the sky, by which he brings the earth to life when it was dead, and scatters about in it creatures of every kind, and the varying direction of the winds, and the clouds subservient between heaven and earth. There are signs for people who use their intellect." Brothers, sisters and friends, may Allah bless you, and remember, I love you for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.